Hey there, I'm Alex, and this is History with Character. Today we are going to be starting on my historically adequate Haunted Mansion Halloween costume. Is it January? Yes. Do I care? No. This costume was originally started last October, or last year, for Halloween 2020, but we all know how that turned out. So, the idea is that we're going to have this finished by this October for this Halloween. So we'll be working on the chemise and drawers because all Victorian outfits need to be built from the skin up. You need to have those proper foundation layers in order to make a garment that actually looks like it's supposed to look. So I'm going to be working on the chemise and drawers. I will go ahead and say that I did not think this through all the way, and so unfortunately a lot of this footage was taken in portrait mode, and I've since figured out that that's not what you're supposed to do, and I'll be more careful about that in the future. Also, some of the footage is a little shaky because my tripod is not the most sturdy item that I own, so occasionally the sewing machine would shake the table, which would shake the tripod really badly, and that would affect the quality of the footage. So please join me as we enter Pintuck Purgatory for a set of Victorian chemise and drawers based off of the Laughing Moon pattern, which I originally bought for the corset, which I have made off camera. Believe me, you didn't want to see that mess. So let's get going. So first things first, we have to cut out all of the fabric. As I'm sure you can tell, my area where I work for these sorts of projects is pretty small. So I started out by cutting out the yoke, which I had to make a mock-up of to make sure that it would fit around my shoulders. You'll notice that I left a little bit of fabric around some of the edges of the mock-up, and that was due to the fact that it didn't quite fit me the way that I wanted it to. So I had to add a little bit of extra length to part of the yoke to make it fit. This took a little bit of time, but once I got into it, it was pretty simple to do. The only thing is I am making this out of a white linen, and linen is notoriously slippy, so I had to be very, very careful how I was cutting out all of these pieces, just because of how slippery it was. While I was on the floor, I also cut out a bunch of bias strips. Now, you'll notice that I am not doing this correctly, and that is because I had never made bias strips on my own before. Up till here, I had always purchased my bias strips, but I wanted to do self-bias, and in this case, cutting them out with a rotary cutter was pretty rough. So just ignore everything that you're seeing here, other than the fact that I did make bias tape. Everything that I'm doing here is incorrect and will be ripped out and redone at later on in the project, off camera. So the next step was to stay stitch the yoke. Because the yoke is cut on a bunch of curves, it leads to a bunch of warping if you don't do this. So I set my machine on the longest possible setting and just did a straight stitch. Following the pattern directions, they said to stay stitch around part of the yoke itself and the collar. I believe it was around the parts that would actually connect to the chemise, and just to keep that from warping. Next up, I had to trim all the seams and press them open for easier turning later. It also helped to prevent bulk. I just finger press them open at this point. Now I had to stitch the two pieces of the yoke together in certain areas. Now, I did do this incorrectly and did have to go back and rip it out and redo it, because essentially you're turning the two pieces into one piece that will easily turn itself out. That way all of the seams are hidden and you don't have to worry about them showing or unraveling. They're all on the inside of the garment. But basically just stitch the two pieces together. At this point I need it nicely, so I just clipped all the curves. Honestly, it would have been easier with my embroidery scissors, but they were across the room and I didn't feel like getting up. Next, I had to turn it inside out, and this was such a pain. This is the tail end of the turning it process. Because you're starting with such small area and then you're having to turn out such a large area, it makes for a very difficult process. But eventually you do get to a larger position and it just flips right out, just like that. I pressed and steamed all of my yoke pieces so that they would lay flat. Overall, I think these came out pretty well. Here I am stay stitching along the edges of the chemise to prevent that from warping or tearing, possibly, just because of the strong curves that go over the bust for this particular pattern. They need to be held pretty stable. Then I started the process of machine gathering all of my chemise pieces so that they would fit into the yoke. Now, I don't like gathering. Gathering is such a huge pain. I really hate gathering even when it's on the machine. I do have a ruffle foot, but I cannot figure out how to get it to work. Then came the long process of stitching the yoke to the chemise. Now this was really difficult on the front part because you had such severe curves that had to meet. So you had one convex and one concave curve that had to be stitched together. So you'll notice that I cut into the seam allowance on both pieces just to make sure that those curves would play nicely. Now here I am gathering and stitching up the back part of the chemise. The way that the instructions were written, you built the yoke and then you attach the front and then you attach the back. So I had to gather up all of the back part of the chemise and stay stitch, all of that all over again. Yes, I wanted to throw something by the end of this. And I'm realizing that looking at a white on white sewing project is not the most thrilling thing. Believe me, it was not the most thrilling thing to sew, but here I am stitching the chemise back to the back of the yoke. Finally, I could stitch the sides together, and you'll see that I've pressed the seam allowances in this particular pattern. This is to prevent bulk at the neck edge and make it easier to work with later on. So I just stitched the top bit, did a little bit of back tacking, and then went all the way down. I messed up on my alignment. I think this was where I had actually clipped the yoke after I mistakenly stitched a couple of seams in the wrong spot. So I did have to account for that in the project, but it ended up working out just fine. And here was where I was kind of able to just zip it right on through. At this point, once again, I had to grade the seams to allow for easier finishing. Again, it would have been easier with my smaller embroidery scissors, but at this point, I think it was after midnight or close to midnight, and I really just wanted to get the main construction of this thing done so I could go to bed. So I struggled my way through grading this seam with my massive fabric scissors. Now it is time to do some felling. Now, I am not Bernadette. I am not very good at hand stitching. I used to not even bother hand finishing costumes, so this is one of the first projects that I've actually had to sit there and work on hand stitching a seam down. I attempted to do it the Victorian method, but unfortunately I got my directions mixed up and started on the wrong end. So I just kind of did what worked, and at the end it worked out. One thing you will notice is that one side of the chemise is a little bit longer. That's an error in the pattern, I believe. I'll end up fixing that later. And then it was game night. So what's always great about game night is, even though we are in the middle of a pandemic, because of online apps, I'm still able to play D&D with my friends. In this case, we were playing Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and because of where I was in the project, I was able to just kind of sit there and fill all of my seams and do most of my work while I was playing D&D. Wait. Please tell me it's MLM. I mean, giant spider is reason enough for me. At this point, I had to go in and finish the yoke. The one thing that I wish I had done differently here is that I was in the middle of a D&D game, so I could not go and press the seam allowance down, so that made things a little bit more difficult. I will redo that the next time I make the chemise. Finally, we get around to doing the pintucks. Now, I have learned I hate doing pintucks. I tried to be all clever and mark where all of the pintucks were going to go in one fell swoop, and it didn't work out for me. So basically all of these pins that I'm putting in here are incorrect, and I ended up taking them out and redoing them later. Then once I got the pintucks set up the way I wanted them, I took them over to my machine and sewed as close to the edge of the fabric as I possibly could. This took forever. Both the chemise and the drawers had to have 6 rows of pintucks, and by the end of it, I was about to scream. So the audio on this is probably really terrible because I don't have a mic that plugs into my phone, but the pintucks are done. It was my first time messing with pintucks, so they're a bit uneven, but, you know, I'm kind of okay with it. It looks like something I made myself, which I'm totally cool with. So I guess it's on to buttons, buttonholes, and all of the little finishing by hand bits, which I'm not a great hand sewer, but we're gonna try it anyway. Then I had to stitch on the 4 buttons at the collar. This took way longer than I really would care to admit, because I just couldn't get the button to stay. Every time I put it on, the thread would break, but I eventually got it. Then I got to do my buttonholes. Now, this is not a great view of how I do buttonholes. Essentially, I do a quick running stitch down the outline, I guess is what you would say, of the buttonhole where I want the buttonhole to be. And then I'll clip into it and then do a buttonhole stitch around all of the edges to secure it and prevent them from fraying. But this view isn't that great, and besides that, it's white thread on white fabric, which is not the most visible thing in the world. Here's where I clip into the buttonholes. You can see I actually do own a pair of embroidery scissors. I wasn't making that up earlier. I just clip from pin to pin. The pins mark the start and end point of my buttonholes, and I figured out these by measuring the buttons to where I wanted the buttonholes to be. At this point, my wax linen thread finally came in from Burnley & Trowbridge, so this is my first attempt ever at using wax thread on a project, and I'm super thrilled with it. I love working with wax thread. I pretty much won't use anything else. At this point I had to finally go in and finish the hemline, which off camera I did even up and then stitched flat to make for a pretty level hem. I'm still not very good at leveling hems in general, whether it's on me or on others. So I'm just doing a quick little hem stitch for miles and miles and miles. But during all of this, at least I had a little bit of entertainment. So here we are starting in on the drawers because finally the chemise is done. So you can see how I am using the template to figure out where I'm going to put my pintucks. I basically spread out the fabric all along my desk and used that template to mark the placement. Pinched up as little fabric as I could and then just pinned it in place. At this point I was pretty sure I was in hell. And if not hell, then purgatory. So I think the more you do pintucks, the better you're going to get at them. I'm a lot happier with how these pintucks are turning out than I was on the chemise, which I don't think I've actually shown. It's actually finished. Please ignore all of the mess in my sewing area because we just had a treadmill delivered and I have not had a chance to clean up after that. But the chemise is complete, and as you can see, the pintucks are a little wibbly wobbly. But on the drawers, they're a lot more even, and I think that just comes with practice and the fact that I'm used to doing them now. So the next time I make that chemise, the pintucks will probably look a lot better. And again, sorry for the audio quality, but I don't have a microphone that works with my phone. So, I guess we're going back into Pintuck Purgatory. Yay. Once again, I just stitched the pintucks as close to the edge as I could. I actually lined up the curve on my presser foot to the edge of the fabric, and that's how I managed to keep things as even as I did. This is probably the most satisfying part of doing pintucks, is when you finally get to press them down into their final position. I love how smooth these look. Next thing was to stitch the leg seam. Now the leg seam is actually pretty small just because of how the drawers fit, because they fit onto a waistband and hang loose with an open crotch. Speaking of the crotch, I had to bind it. This is where those bias strips that I cut out earlier finally came in handy. I was able to stitch these down, iron, flip, iron, and then stitch down the other side as well to self-bind that edge to prevent fraying. Now, cutting linen on the bias is awful. I swore so much while I was doing it. It's so bad, even with a rotary cutter. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. So once you press it for the first time, you then have to turn it over and press it again so that the other side, the raw seam, is encased, or the raw edge is encased in the seam itself. So here I am just pressing it down. By the time I finished this, it was 1-inch bias binding that shows only about 1/4 inch. He loves playing catch. So now we're back to gathering. Did I mention I hate gathering? I hated gathering on this too. At least with hand gathering, the thread is usually a little bit stronger, but with machine gathers, I'm always scared I'm going to pull out the wrong thread or the thread is going to snap. Fortunately it didn't, and I got this super cute needle case. like I said, I'm still not very good at hand sewing. I still struggle a lot, even with the simple things like threading a needle. But at this point, I had to stitch on the waistband. I apparently misplaced my footage of me stitching on the front side of the waistband, but it's the same general concept as the binding at the crotch. You sew 2 raw edges together, flip one of them up and over so that the other raw edge is encased, and then stitch that side back down. Once again, I am probably playing D&D here, or watching D&D as the case may be. That's one thing that I do love about hand sewing, is that it's so portable. I can do it anywhere and not have to worry about other things. I can listen to a book or a podcast or watch a movie and don't have to worry too much about accidentally stabbing myself in the fingers or through the fingers like my mom once did. Once I got the waistband fully attached, I had to stitch 5/8 of an inch away from the top edge. This was to create a drawstring channel for the legs to sit on, and I had to do this all the way across both legs. Finally, I got to sit down and hem it. Hemming is always supposed to be hand sewn, and so I just sat down on my couch and got to work. Not sure why I'm wearing glasses in this shot, though. At this point, my boyfriend dragged me to the beach. Well, I say dragged. His family has a nice little beach house, and so we packed up our stuff and went for about a week. And I got to spend some lovely time out on the back dock in a hammock with my sewing and a dog. This was not Rocket's first time at the beach, but it was his first time figuring out that he could dig literally anywhere and it would be totally fine. Back home, I sat down for the long and arduous task of finishing all of the seams of the drawers, which was really just the leg seams on the inside. I, at this point, had decided that I was going to save all of my hand finishing work for the beach, and I didn't get to all of it, which I was totally fine with, but I had to work on it a little bit once I got home. And finally, working on that hem, just trying to make it line up a little bit with the Pintucks. I did manage to get the Victorian method down here, although I do still struggle with that for felling. I'm good at it for hemming, but not for felling. I did attempt to do a rolled hem. I think in some places it worked more as a rolled hem, and in some places it worked more as a teeny tiny little folded hem. But linen is really, really good for hems like that because it has a tendency to stick where you put it. So that's it. I have completed my chemise and drawers for the Haunted Mansion Victorian ensemble. It's been an interesting ride for sure. I've definitely learned a few things, and I'm excited to try to remake them again sometime in the future when I kind of have a better understanding of what I did wrong. Overall, they fit like they're supposed to. I mean, they're not super form-fitting garments, and they're not intended to fit really, really tightly like a corset does, but they also fit on me. They look nice. I don't have any worn photos yet because it's kind of cold out right now. Don't know if you've noticed, but it's February in North Carolina, and that means it's cold. So hopefully I'll be able to get some worn photos of them once it warms up a little bit. But until next time, when I will be starting on the bustle for this wonderful garment, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe, y'all.